The morning sun painted the royal courtyard in golden light as hundreds of people gathered for the biggest martial arts event of the year. Master Chen stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, his simple brown robes making him almost invisible, among the flashy uniforms and colorful banners everywhere. He had walked for 3 days straight to get here, coming down from his peaceful monastery high in the mountains. His feet were sore and his travel bag felt heavy on his shoulders, but his eyes sparkled with excitement. This was the king's tournament, something he had only heard about in stories from other monks who had visited their mountain home. The courtyard was massive, bigger than anything Chen had ever seen. Marble pillars reached toward the sky, and golden decorations caught the sunlight from every corner. Red silk banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, each one showing the royal family's symbol of a golden dragon. People were everywhere. Young fighters stretched and practiced their moves, their muscles rippling as they prepared for competition. Older masters sat quietly, watching everything with calm, knowing eyes. Families had come to cheer for their favorite fighters, and merchants sold food and drinks from small stalls around the edges of the courtyard. But what really caught Chen's attention were the royal guards. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They stood like statues around the king's special viewing area, wearing shiny armor that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. Their red capes moved gently in the wind, and each guard carried weapons that looked both beautiful and deadly. The captain of these guards was a man everyone called Steelwind. Even from far away, Chen could see why people feared him. He was tall and broad, with shoulders like a mountain and arms thick as tree branches. His armor was fancier than the others, with extra gold decorations that showed his high rank. Steelwind walked around the courtyard like he owned it. Other people quickly moved out of his way when they saw him coming. Even the strongest fighters seemed nervous when he looked at them. His face was hard as stone and his dark eyes seemed to look right through people. "That's Captain Steelwind," whispered an old man standing near Chen. "They say he's never lost a fight in his whole life, not once." Chen nodded politely, but said nothing. In his monastery, the older monks had taught him that true strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about protecting people and doing what was right. But he kept these thoughts to himself. The tournament was about to begin, and the prize was incredible. The winner wouldn't just get gold coins or a fancy trophy. They would earn the honor of training the royal family's personal guards. It was a job that came with respect, good pay, and a place to live in the royal palace itself. Fighters had come from all over the kingdom. Some used swords that gleamed like silver lightning. Others fought with their bare hands, their fists hard as rocks from years of training. There were experts in staff fighting, knife throwing, and ancient wrestling techniques that few people still remembered. Chen's own style was different from most of what he saw. His monastery taught something called gentle redirect, a way of fighting that used an opponent's own strength against them. Instead of meeting force with force, a skilled practitioner would redirect energy, like water flowing around a rock. The other monks had always told him, "The strongest tree is the one that bends in the storm, not the one that tries to stand rigid against the wind." But looking around at all these powerful fighters, Chen wondered if his gentle methods would be enough. A loud horn blew across the courtyard, and everyone turned toward the royal pavilion. The king was arriving for the opening ceremony. He was younger than Chen had expected, maybe 40 years old, with kind eyes and a warm smile. The crowd cheered as he waved to them. The king stood up to speak, and his voice carried clearly across the courtyard. "Welcome, brave fighters, to our annual tournament. You come here not just to test your skills, but to show the noble spirit of martial arts. Remember, true warriors protect the innocent and serve something greater than themselves." Chen smiled at these words. They sounded like something his old master back at the monastery might say. But then Captain Steelwind stepped forward to demonstrate the skills of the royal guards, and Chen's smile faded. The captain's movements were powerful and precise, but there was something cold about them. When he broke wooden boards with his fists, he did it with unnecessary force. When he showed sword techniques, his strikes were meant to intimidate, not inspire. The crowd clapped loudly, but Chen noticed that people seemed more afraid than impressed. Children hid behind their parents when Steelwind looked their way. Even other fighters stepped back when he practiced his moves nearby. As the ceremony continued, Chen found himself watching the captain more and more carefully. There was skill there, no doubt about it. But there was also something that bothered him deeply. This man had forgotten that martial arts were supposed to protect people, not frighten them. The tournament rules were announced. Fighters would compete in different categories, starting with weapons and ending with hand-to-hand combat. The matches would continue for 3 days, with the final championship bout taking place in front of the king himself. Chen had entered the hand-to-hand division. It felt right to compete using only the techniques the monastery had taught him, without weapons or fancy equipment. Just his body, his mind, and years of patient training. As the crowd began to spread out for the first matches, Chen found a quiet spot under a large tree to sit and meditate. He closed his eyes and tried to center himself, the way his teachers had shown him. But even with his eyes closed, he could hear Captain Steelwind's harsh voice echoing across the courtyard as he gave orders to the other guards. Something was going to happen today. Chen could feel it in the air, like the tension before a storm. He just didn't know what it would be, or how it would change everything that came after. The morning matches had gone well and the crowd was in high spirits. People were laughing, sharing food, and cheering for their favorite fighters. The sun was getting higher, making the royal courtyard warm and pleasant. Chen had won his first 2 matches using gentle techniques that surprised his opponents. He never hurt anyone badly, just redirected their attacks until they lost balance or became tired. The crowd seemed to enjoy watching his unusual style, and several people had complimented him between matches. During the lunch break, many spectators moved closer to the royal pavilion, hoping to get a better look at the king and his family. It was a special treat to see royalty up close, and people were excited and curious. An elderly woman named Mrs. Liu had traveled for 2 days to bring her young grandson to see the tournament. The little boy had never been away from their small village before, and his eyes were wide with wonder at all the sights and sounds. "Grandma, can we get closer to see the king?" the boy asked, tugging on her sleeve. Mrs. Liu smiled at her grandson's excitement. She was getting old, and walking was harder than it used to be, but she wanted to make this day special for him. They slowly made their way through the crowd, trying to find a spot where the boy could see better. The area near the royal pavilion was getting crowded. People pressed forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the royal family. Most were respectful and patient, but the pushing and crowding was making it difficult for everyone to see. Mrs. Liu and her grandson found themselves caught in the middle of the crowd. The boy was too short to see over the adults in front of them, and Mrs. Liu was struggling to keep her balance as people moved around them. "Please, just a little closer," she said quietly, not wanting to cause any trouble. She took a small step forward, trying to help her grandson get a better view. That's when Captain Steelwind noticed the growing crowd near the royal area. His face darkened with anger as he saw all the common people getting so close to where the king was sitting. In his mind, these people were getting too familiar, too comfortable. They needed to be reminded of their place. He strode over with heavy steps, his armor clanking with each movement. The crowd sensed his approach and began to step back nervously. But Mrs. Liu, who was a bit deaf, didn't hear him coming. "Move back, all of you." Steelwind's voice boomed across the area. "You're too close to His Majesty." People began shuffling backward quickly, but the crowd was thick and it was hard to move fast. Mrs. Liu, still trying to help her frightened grandson, was moving as quickly as she could with her old legs. "I said, move!" Steelwind shouted again, this time much louder. What happened next made Chen's blood run cold. Instead of waiting for the elderly woman to make her way through the crowd, or offering to help her move safely, Captain Steelwind roughly grabbed Mrs. Liu's shoulder and shoved her backward. The old woman stumbled, nearly falling to the hard stone ground. Her grandson cried out in fear and confusion. Several other people had to catch Mrs. Liu to keep her from getting badly hurt. "Please, sir, I was just trying to let my grandson see," Mrs. Liu said in a shaky voice, clearly frightened and embarrassed. But Steelwind wasn't finished. "You people need to learn respect," he continued, his voice getting louder and angrier. "The royal family doesn't want to be bothered by peasants pushing and crowding around like animals." The entire area had gone quiet except for his harsh words. People looked down at their feet, afraid to meet his eyes. The little boy was crying now, clinging to his grandmother's dress. Chen watched all of this from about 20 feet away, and something inside him began to burn with quiet anger. This wasn't right. These were good people who had come to enjoy a celebration. They deserved to be treated with respect, not pushed around and insulted. He looked around at the other spectators. They all seemed afraid to say anything. Even some of the other royal guards looked uncomfortable with their captain's behavior, but none of them dared to speak up. Chen's monastery training had taught him many things, but one lesson stood out, above all others. A true warrior protects those who cannot protect themselves. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Chen stepped forward through the crowd. His movement was calm and quiet, but somehow people noticed him and began to make space for him to pass. "Excuse me, Captain," Chen said in a polite but clear voice that carried across the silent courtyard. Steelwind turned toward him, surprised that anyone had dared to interrupt his display of authority. "What did you say?" "I said excuse me," Chen repeated, still polite but with steel in his voice now. "I think you might be forgetting something important." The captain's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And what might that be?" Chen gestured gently toward Mrs. Liu and her grandson, who were still huddled together looking scared. "These people are citizens of the kingdom. They came here to celebrate and show respect to the royal family. They don't deserve to be treated like enemies." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people seemed shocked that anyone would dare to challenge Captain Steelwind. Others nodded quietly in agreement with Chen's words. Steelwind's face turned red with anger. "How dare you question me? Do you know who I am?" "I know who you are," Chen replied calmly. "The question is, do you remember who you're supposed to be?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. Even the king himself had noticed the commotion and was watching from his seat in the pavilion. Captain Steelwind stepped closer to Chen, his hand moving toward the sword at his side. "You want to make this about fighting, monk? Fine. Let's see if your mountain training prepared you for the real world." Chen didn't want to fight. He had come here for a tournament, not to get into conflicts with royal guards. But looking at Mrs. Liu's frightened face and her grandson's tears, he knew he couldn't back down. "I didn't come here to fight you, Captain," Chen said quietly. "I came here to remind you that strength should be used to protect people, not to intimidate them." But Steelwind was past listening to reason. The fact that a simple monk had challenged him in front of hundreds of people, including the king, was more than his pride could handle. "Then let me show you what real strength looks like," he snarled, and his hand gripped his sword handle tightly. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The courtyard was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Hundreds of people held their breath as Captain Steelwind and Master Chen faced each other. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if nature itself knew something important was about to happen. Chen stood perfectly still, his feet planted shoulder-width apart in a basic meditation stance. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and his breathing was slow and steady. To anyone watching, he looked completely relaxed, almost like he was about to take a nap rather than face the kingdom's most feared warrior. Captain Steelwind, on the other hand, looked like a coiled spring ready to explode. His muscles were tense, his jaw was clenched, and his eyes burned with anger. The golden decorations on his armor caught the sunlight as his chest rose and fell with quick, angry breaths. "Last chance to apologize, monk," Steelwind growled through gritted teeth. "Get on your knees and beg forgiveness for your disrespect, and maybe I'll only break one of your arms." Chen's response was quiet but firm. "I cannot apologize for trying to protect innocent people, Captain. That's not something I will ever be sorry for." The crowd pressed closer, forming a loose circle around the two men. Everyone wanted to see what would happen, but nobody wanted to get too close to the coming fight. Parents pulled their children behind them, and older spectators climbed on benches to get a better view. From his seat in the royal pavilion, the king leaned forward with interest. He had heard about this monk who fought with unusual techniques, and he was curious to see how this confrontation would end. Captain Steelwind drew his sword with a metallic ring that echoed across the courtyard. The blade was beautiful and deadly, forged by the kingdom's best weapon makers. It had never tasted defeat in all the years Steelwind had carried it. "I've been the champion of this kingdom for 15 years," Steelwind announced loudly, raising his sword above his head. "I've defeated every challenger who dared to face me. Today I add one more victory to my record." But Chen wasn't looking at the sword. Instead, his eyes were focused on Steelwind's face, reading every tiny expression and movement. His monastery training had taught him to see beyond weapons and armor, to understand the true nature of his opponent. What he saw in Steelwind's eyes was not just anger but fear. The captain was afraid that his reputation might be damaged. He was afraid that people might stop fearing him. And most of all, he was afraid that he might not be as invincible as everyone believed. This fear was making him sloppy and predictable. Without warning, Steelwind launched his attack. His sword came down in a powerful overhead strike that could have split a wooden post in half. The movement was fast and strong, exactly the kind of technique that had made him famous throughout the kingdom. But Chen was already moving. In the monastery, his teachers had spent years showing him something they called reading the wind. It meant seeing an attack before it actually happened, by watching the tiny movements that came first. The slight shift of weight, the tension in certain muscles, the direction of the eyes. By the time Steelwind's sword began its downward swing, Chen had already seen where it was going and how fast it would arrive. Instead of jumping backward or trying to block the heavy blade, Chen took one small step to his left. The sword whistled, past his right shoulder, missing him by less than 2 inches but never coming close to actually hitting him. As the sword continued downward, carried by Steelwind's own momentum, Chen did something that looked almost impossible. He reached out with his left hand and gently touched Steelwind's right wrist, just at the point where his hand gripped the sword handle. The touch was so light it barely seemed like contact at all. But Chen's fingers found a precise spot on the wrist, a pressure point that his teachers had shown him years ago. With just the right amount of pressure applied at exactly the right angle, this point could temporarily disrupt the nerve signals that controlled grip strength. At the exact same moment, while Steelwind was still moving forward with the force of his sword strike, Chen brought his right hand up in what looked like the gentlest possible movement. It wasn't a punch or a karate chop. It was more like someone softly placing their palm against another person's cheek. But this gentle palm strike was perfectly timed and positioned. It connected with a specific point on the side of Steelwind's face, just in front of his ear, where several important nerves came together close to the surface of the skin. The monastery had taught Chen that the human body was like a complex musical instrument. If you knew where to touch it and how, you could create harmony, but you could also create discord. The combination of the pressure point on Steelwind's wrist and the nerve strike to his face created exactly the kind of discord Chen intended. Steelwind's grip on his sword suddenly weakened as the signals from his brain to his hand were interrupted. His sense of balance, controlled by nerves near where Chen had touched his face, began to falter. And most importantly, his forward momentum, which had been driving his attack, suddenly became his enemy instead of his friend. From the crowd's perspective, what they saw was almost magical. Master Chen had barely seemed to move at all. One moment Captain Steelwind was charging forward with his sword raised high, looking unstoppable. The next moment he was stumbling, forward with no control over his movement, his sword falling from his suddenly weak grip. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds from start to finish. But those 3 seconds were about to change everything that anyone in the courtyard thought they knew about fighting, about power, and about what it really meant to be strong. Steelwind's eyes went wide with shock and confusion as he felt his body betraying him. His legs, which had carried him through countless victories, suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. His sense of up and down became scrambled, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. He tried to stop his forward motion, tried to regain his balance, tried to understand what had just happened to him. But it was too late. The great Captain Steelwind, undefeated champion of the kingdom, was about to fall. Time seemed to slow down as Captain Steelwind's body began to betray him. His powerful legs, which had carried him to victory in countless battles, suddenly felt like they were made of water. The confident stride that had intimidated enemies for 15 years turned into an awkward stumble. The crowd watched in complete silence, hardly believing what they were seeing. Some people thought they must be imagining things. Others rubbed their eyes and looked again, sure that their vision was playing tricks on them. Steelwind's face showed pure confusion and panic. He had never felt anything like this before. The gentle touch to his face had done something to his inner ear, the part of the body that helps maintain balance. It was like trying to walk on a ship during a storm, except the storm was inside his own head. He tried to plant his feet firmly on the ground, tried to stop his forward motion, but his body wouldn't obey his commands. His arms windmilled wildly as he fought to stay upright. But the harder he tried to balance, the more he tilted to one side. His famous sword, the blade that had never known defeat, clattered uselessly on the stone courtyard floor. The sound of metal hitting stone seemed to echo forever in the stunned silence. What did you do to me?" Steelwind gasped, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. But Chen didn't answer. He simply stood where he was, watching with calm eyes as the captain's own momentum carried him backward. There was no satisfaction on Chen's face, no pride or anger. He looked almost sad, like someone watching a friend make a mistake they couldn't prevent. Steelwind took one stumbling step backward, then another. His heavy armor, which had always made him feel powerful and protected, now felt like it was pulling him down. Each piece of metal that had once been a symbol of his strength was now working against him. The crowd began to murmur as they realized what was happening. Captain Steelwind, the man who had seemed as solid and unmovable as a mountain, was actually going to fall. A young boy in the crowd pointed and whispered loudly to his father, "Papa, why is the captain walking funny?" His father quickly hushed him, but other people were beginning to whisper too. The sound grew like distant thunder, starting soft but getting louder as more people realized they were witnessing something that had never happened before. Mrs. Liu, the elderly woman who had been pushed around by Steelwind just minutes earlier, watched with wide eyes. Her grandson had stopped crying and was staring in amazement at the scene unfolding before them. Steelwind's backward stumble was picking up speed now. He tried desperately to regain control, reaching out with his arms to grab onto something, anything that might stop his fall. But there was nothing within reach except empty air. His feet, confused by the mixed signals from his disrupted nervous system, couldn't find their proper rhythm. He stepped on his own cape, which tangled around his legs and made everything worse. "Impossible," breathed one of the other royal guards, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. How did a simple monk do that? But even as he spoke, the answer was becoming clear to anyone who knew about fighting. This wasn't about magic or tricks. This was about understanding the human body better than most people understood their own shadows. Chen had spent years learning not just how to fight, but how the body worked. He knew where every nerve ran, where every muscle connected, and how different systems in the body talk to each other. His teachers at the monastery had shown him that violence wasn't about causing damage. It was about understanding how to redirect energy and disrupt control. The captain's fall seemed to happen in slow motion. First his knees buckled as his legs finally gave up trying to support his weight. Then his body began to tip backward, like a tall tree that had been cut at the base. He threw his arms out to his sides, trying to break his fall, but his balance was so completely gone that he couldn't even control where he would land. His mouth opened in shock and surprise, but no sound came out. The golden decorations on his armor caught the sunlight one last time as he fell. For just a moment he looked less like a fearsome warrior and more like a confused man who couldn't understand what was happening to his own body. Then, with a tremendous crash that echoed across the entire courtyard, Captain Steelwind hit the ground. The sound was incredible. His heavy armor struck the stone floor with a noise like thunder, and the metal pieces rattled and clanged against each other as he landed in an undignified heap. Dust rose up around him from the impact, creating a small cloud that drifted across the courtyard. His red cape, which had been flowing proudly behind him just moments before, now lay twisted and crumpled beneath his body. For a few seconds, Nobody moved. The entire crowd stood frozen in shock, staring at the impossible scene before them. The bout, undefeatable Captain Steelwind was lying on his back on the ground, looking up at the sky with dazed, confused eyes. A small child somewhere in the crowd began to giggle, then quickly stopped when her mother shushed her. But the damage was done. The spell of fear that Steelwind had cast over everyone was beginning to break. People began to whisper more loudly now, pointing and talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Some were laughing, not cruelly, but with the kind of relief that comes when you realize that something you were afraid of isn't as scary as you thought. From the royal pavilion, the king leaned forward even further, his eyes wide with amazement. In all his years of watching tournaments and battles, he had never seen anything like this. A simple monk, using what looked like the gentlest possible touch, had defeated his most feared guard. Chen looked down at the fallen captain, then extended his hand to help him up. Even after everything that had happened, there was no anger or mockery in his gesture, just one person offering to help another who had fallen down. But Steelwind wasn't ready to accept help yet. He was still trying to understand what had happened to him, still struggling with the fact that his world had just been turned completely upside down. The great Captain Steelwind, undefeated champion of the kingdom, was learning what it felt like to lose for the very first time in his life. Captain Steelwind lay on the cold stone ground for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. His armor was uncomfortable against his back, and his pride hurt more than his body did. The sound of hundreds of people whispering and talking felt like tiny needles in his ears. Slowly, carefully, he began to sit up. His balance was returning to normal now, and the strange dizzy feeling was fading away. But the confusion and shock were still there, written all over his face. He looked up at Master Chen, who was still standing exactly where he had been during their brief encounter. The monk's hand was still extended in an offer to help, and his expression was kind rather than victorious. For a moment, Steelwind considered refusing the help. His pride told him to get up on his own, to maintain what little dignity he had left. But something in Chen's eyes stopped him. There was no mockery there, no sense of triumph, just genuine concern for another human being. Slowly, Steelwind reached out and took Chen's offered hand. The monk's grip was firm but gentle as he helped the captain to his feet. As soon as Steelwind was standing, Chen released his hand and took a respectful step backward, giving the captain space to collect himself. "How?" Steelwind asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you do that?" Instead of boasting or explaining his technique, Chen simply said, "Your monastery taught you to fight with strength and speed. Mine taught me to fight with understanding." "Understanding?" Chen nodded. "Understanding how the body works, understanding how to redirect energy instead of meeting it head-on, understanding that sometimes the gentlest touch can be more powerful than the hardest punch." Steelwind bent down to pick up his sword, moving slowly and carefully. His legs still felt a bit shaky, but his balance was mostly back to normal. As he straightened up, he looked at the weapon that had served him so well for so many years, and for the first time he wondered if there might be better ways to solve problems. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement and amazement, but their whispers were gradually getting louder. People were starting to realize that they had just witnessed history being made. "Did you see that? How did he do it?" The captain didn't even see it coming. That monk barely touched him. But the most important reaction came from the royal pavilion. King Richard had been watching the entire encounter with growing interest, and now he stood up from his throne. The crowd noticed his movement and gradually fell silent again, waiting to see what their ruler would say. The king walked down from his elevated platform and approached the two men. His royal guards followed behind him, but he waved them back, indicating that he wanted to handle this situation personally. "Master Chen," the king said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard. "That was the most remarkable display of martial arts I have ever witnessed." Chen bowed respectfully. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I hope I have not caused too much disruption to your tournament." "Disruption?" The king smiled. My friend, you have shown us something extraordinary. You defeated my strongest guard not through violence or brutality, but through skill and understanding. And more importantly, you did it to protect innocent people. He turned to look at Mrs. Liu and her grandson, who were still standing in the crowd looking amazed by everything that had happened. I saw what led to this confrontation, the king continued, his voice becoming more serious. A guard who is supposed to protect our citizens was instead frightening and mistreating them. That is not acceptable. Captain Steelwind's face turned red with shame. For the first time, he was seeing his own actions through someone else's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. Captain, the king said, turning to face Steelwind, you have served our kingdom well for many years, but today you have learned an important lesson about what it truly means to be strong. Yes, Your Majesty, Steelwind replied quietly. I have. Then something happened that surprised everyone, including Chen. Instead of being angry or embarrassed about his defeat, Steelwind turned to face the monk with genuine curiosity in his eyes. Master Chen, he said, would you be willing to teach me? I've spent 15 years thinking I knew everything about fighting, but today you showed me how little I actually understand, the crowd murmured with approval. It took real courage and wisdom for someone like Steelwind to admit that he still had things to learn, especially after being defeated so publicly. Chen looked thoughtful for a moment. Captain, learning the way I fight isn't just about new techniques. It means changing how you think about what strength really is. Are you sure you're ready for that? I'm sure, Steelwind replied without hesitation. Today you showed me that I've been using my abilities to make people afraid instead of making them feel safe. I want to learn how to be better. The king smiled at this exchange, clearly pleased by what he was hearing. Master Chen, I have a proposal for you. Yes, Your Majesty? The original prize for this tournament was the position of training instructor for our royal guards. I can think of no one better suited for that job than someone who can defeat our strongest warrior with kindness and skill, instead of violence and fear. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People were clapping, whistling, and shouting their approval. Mrs. Liu was crying happy tears and her grandson was jumping up and down with excitement. Chen looked surprised and honored by the offer. Your Majesty, I am deeply grateful, but I would want to make sure that any training I provide focuses on protection and service, not intimidation. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, the king replied. Our guards should make people feel safer, not more afraid. You've already begun to teach that lesson today. Captain Steelwind stepped forward again. Master Chen, if you accept this position, I would be honored to be your first student. I have a lot to learn and a lot to make up for. Chen looked around at the crowd, at the king, and at the captain who had just offered to learn from him. His monastery had always taught that knowledge was meant to be shared, and that the best way to honor your teachers was to become a teacher yourself. I accept, he said simply. The cheers from the crowd were even louder this time. People were hugging each other, and many were wiping away tears of joy. They had come to watch a tournament, but instead they had witnessed something much more important. They had seen that real strength comes from protecting others, not from dominating them. As the celebration continued around them, Chen and Steelwind stood together, teacher and student, beginning a friendship that would change not just their own lives, but the entire culture of the kingdom's guard force. From that day forward, the royal guards became known not for being feared, but for being the kind and skilled protectors that the people truly needed. And it all started with one gentle touch that taught everyone the true meaning of strength. The tournament continued for 2 more days, but everyone agreed that the most important victory had already been won. Master Chen had shown them all that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to choose gentleness over violence, understanding over force, and protection over intimidation. Years later, when people told stories about the great tournament, they always remembered it as the day a humble monk changed a kingdom with nothing more than wisdom, courage, and the lightest possible touch.